Okay, so moving on to the second general consideration. The first one, as you may recall, was about the fundamentally integrated nature of organism environment. It's a fundamental integration, getting out of integration, falling into partial disintegration is kind of the beginning of a process that gets developed into inquiry in higher organisms. So going on to the second consideration here, Dewey writes that the structure and course of life behavior has a definite pattern, spatial and temporal. This pattern definitely foreshadows the general pattern of inquiry. So we find kind of the beginnings of inquiry in the pattern of life behavior, the spatial and temporal pattern that you can find in the behavior of living things. For inquiry grows out of an earlier state of settled adjustment, which, because of disturbance, is indeterminate or problematic, corresponding to the first phase of tensional activity. And this was something that we discussed earlier in this chapter. How you get this tension between organism environment, this disturbance, that's the early phase, beginning phase. So inquiry grows out of, so that before there's a state of settled adjustment, which is disturbed, right? Because of disturbance is indeterminate or problematic. So this relationship between organism environment gets out of integration, starts to become problematic, and then going on to the latter part of the sentence, and then passes into inquiry proper, corresponding to the searching and exploration activities of an organism. When the search is successful, belief or assertion is the counterpart upon this level of the redintegration upon the organic level. So then when organism environment get back into integration, when the disturbance is overcome or settled, that's correlative. When we start talking about inquiry, that's correlative to this state of belief or assertion that something is the case. That gets established at the end of successful inquiry. A detailed account of the pattern of inquiry is given in Chapter 6, but the following considerations flow so directly from the pattern of life behavior that they should be noted here. And so Dewey's going to give some various considerations that come out of this notion of the pattern of life behavior, out of which inquiry eventually develops. So A, the first one, there is no inquiry that does not involve the making of some change in environing conditions. So inquiry involves changing the environment. This fact is exemplified in the indispensable place of experiment in inquiry, since experimentation is deliberate modification of prior conditions. Right? When you experiment to test something, that involves changing the environment in different ways to see what happens. Right? You're testing your hypothesis by changing different variables to see what happens. Even in the pre-scientific stage, an individual moves head, eyes, often the entire body, in order to determine the conditions to be taken account of in forming a judgment. So even before you get to science, organisms move around to figure out what is the problem, right? What is the problem? What are likely solutions? This involves moving around to get a better sense of your environment, changing your relation to the environment, which is in effect changing your environment. Such movements affect a change in environmental relations, right? As I just said. Active pressure by touch, the acts of pushing, pulling, pounding, and manipulating to find out what things are like, is an even more overt approach to scientific experimentation. Okay, so part A, we heard about scientific experimentation, kind of experimenting with the environment to figure things out. What are things like? And then B, second thing to consider, the pattern is serial or sequential. So Dewey has discussed this earlier. It has already been noted that this trait of life behavior becomes more marked with the emergence of distance receptors and of the neural apparatus necessary for coordinating their excitation with contact receptors and with the muscular, circulatory, and respiratory mechanisms which are involved in behavior. And if you remember, this sounds very complicated, but basically the sequential or seriated nature of behavior, this becomes more obvious and more necessary to take account of when you start dealing with organisms that can take account of the distance, that can see, hear, smell. These are the main distance receptors in animals. And when those get linked up in, they of course are naturally linked, but when those are integrated with contact reception, so touch, taste especially, and of course the sense of one's own body and things like that, when those become integrated so that you see stuff in the distance or become able to perceive stuff in the distance and move toward it for the purpose of coming into contact with it, then it really becomes important to pay attention to this sequential aspect of behavior, right? Where you see, move toward, grasp, and so on. So there's this sequence, this fluid sequence of things in behavior. Let's see here. So in the human organism, organic retention or habit patterns give rise to recollection. So now we're getting into some, memory basically, right? So things get, we might say, stored in the body or retained by the body. Basically, the body gets changed by experience. And we can think of that as a kind of organic retention, right? The forming of habits. Goals or consequences that are even more remote in time and space are then set up, and the intervening process of search becomes more seriated in temporal span and in connecting links than in the case of the simple presence of distance stimuli. So here, right, so we can see something or experience something that gets kind of stored with us. This idea of storage is not quite right, and it's not one that Dewey used. It's more of a computer metaphor, and Dewey didn't really know much about computers living before that. But anyway, I think just for now, it's good enough maybe that we experience something, we can return to it later, right? We can recall it. We can become displaced from an experience. I sometimes talk, and other people have talked about this as displaced perceptions. You've got this contact perception, and then which all primitive organisms have in some way. All organisms, I should say, all living things. And then in some organisms, you get distance perception. You can see and hear and smell across larger spans of distance, so that you're not totally reliant on what is actually in contact with you. And then in some organisms, you can maybe pick out human organisms as distinctive here, as especially exemplifying this trait. We get this displaced perception of being able to recall things that are distant from, farther away than what one can experience in the here and now, right? So you can recall what happened yesterday. You can no longer see yesterday, the objects of yesterday, but you can recall them, or you can recall things that you saw many miles away, for example, and that can become part of your present behavior. But even the main point being that when you start taking those things into account, then behavior and intervening processes become much more important and notable. Formation of an end in view or consequence to be brought about is conditioned by recollection. It requires making plans in conjunction with selection and ordering of consecutive means by which the plan may become an actuality. So actually planning to do something in the future requires this kind of recollection, right? Because you can recall something that is not there anymore here and now and plan to go towards that thing in the future. All right, but that will be addressed in other places in the book, so it will hopefully become more clear than this kind of sketchy account. Let's go on to C and D. Let me check where I am in my schedule. Okay, so C and D. C, the serially connected processes and operations by means of which a consummatory close is brought into being are, by description, intermediate and instrumental. So talking about mediation, what comes in between the state of tension and the consummation, the reintegration. This distinctive characteristic prefigures on the biological level the interpretation that must be given upon the level of inquiry to operations of inference and discourse in their relation to final judgment as the consummation of inquiry. So yeah, in Dewey's logic, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at inference and discourse and their place as in between, in the middle of the recognition of a problem and the consummation of the inquiry that comes out of the recognition of the problem. So inference and discourse are kinds of tools we have for basically resolving problems, coming to a consummation, a state of consummation. Okay, and then D, the basic importance of the serial relation in logic is rooted in the conditions of life itself. Modification of both organic and environmental energies is involved in life activity. This organic fact foreshadows learning and discovery, with the consequent outgrowth of new needs and new problematic situations. So yeah, we've touched on this already as well, but this is a good new description of it, that is of the problem that is coming up out of the generation of new problems out of the solution of old problems, basically. Inquiry in settling the disturbed relation of organism-environment, which defines doubt, so inquiry does not merely remove doubt by recurrence to a prior adaptive integration, right? You're not returning to a previous condition, you're making a new condition of integration. So it constitutes new environing conditions that occasion new problems. So inquiry institutes new environing conditions that occasion new problems. Inquiry and the outcome of inquiry. They give you new conditions, and these new conditions become occasions for new problems. What the organism learns during this process produces new powers that make new demands upon the environment. When we discussed this before, I think earlier in this chapter, I believe, if not in the introduction, I forget exactly, but I mentioned agriculture, for example, as a solution to one problem that creates a whole new set of problems. All right, so in short, is that where I am? Yeah, so in short, as special problems are resolved, new ones tend to emerge. There is no such thing as a final settlement, because every settlement introduces the conditions of some degree of a new unsettling. In the stage of development marked by the emergence of science, deliberate institution of problems becomes an objective of inquiry. So in science, we want to find problems, figure out new problems that we maybe did not notice before. Philosophy, in case it has not lost touch with science, may play an important role in determining formulation of these problems and in suggesting hypothetical solutions. But the moment philosophy supposes it can find a final and comprehensive solution, it ceases to be inquiry and becomes either apologetics or propaganda. So a little bit touching on the role of philosophy here. It can help figuring out how to best formulate problems, even suggest hypotheses, but it's not or should not be in the business of proposing final and comprehensive solutions. This is just philosophy as propaganda or dogma. And I meant to mention earlier that this section D that we just finished has a very kind of Hegelian feel to it. Dewey, of course, was a former Hegelian. He was a Hegelian in his youth, basically, a neo-Hegelian maybe. And yeah, this idea of problems and then solving problems, but at the same time generating new problems has a very Hegelian flavor to it. But I won't dwell on that at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to read, go through E and then take a break. So, E, I think, is the last one, actually. E, so from the postulate of naturalistic continuity, so this idea that nature is a continuum, there's no kind of breaks, no breaks between processes or substances that are naturally there. I mean, we can analyze things out, right? But nature is a continuum. All right, so from the postulate of naturalistic continuity with its prime corollary that inquiry is a development out of organic environmental integration and interaction, something follows regarding the relation of psychology and logic. Yeah, so from this idea of nature as a continuum and environment and organism are, things that we can analyze out of that continuum, there's something to be said here because of that about how psychology and logic are related. So the negative side of this conclusion has already been suggested. So we've, several videos ago, I think in the introduction or the first chapter, whatever, Dewey has critiqued the mentalistic interpretation of logic, or the problems that arise from a mentalistic interpretation of psychology and the separation of psychology from logic. The negative side has already been suggested. The assumptions of mentalistic psychology have no place in logical theory. The divorce between logic and scientific methodology, discussed in the previous chapter, has its basis largely in the belief that since inquiry involves doubt, suggestion, observation, conjecture, sagacious discernment, etc., and since it is assumed that all these things are mentalistic, there is a gulf between inquiry, or reflective thinking, and logic. So there's an assumption that mental stuff is a separate realm among some people. And if you take this assumption seriously, then there would be a gulf between logic and reflective thought. Or inquiry, better. Inquiry and logic. And we saw Dewey before critiquing this idea that logic is something separate that can be imposed on inquiry from the outside. Given the mentalistic assumption, the conclusion is just. But the recognition of the natural continuity of inquiry with organic behavior, the fact that it is a developed mode of such behavior, destroys the assumption. Right? So if we take inquiry as just a mode of behavior, rather than something occurring in a mind separate from organic behavior, then there's no reason to assume that logic and inquiry are separate things, totally separate things. The student of intellectual history is aware of how the new scientific standpoint of the 16th and 17th centuries succeeded in setting up a gulf between the mental and the physical. The former, the mental, was supposed to constitute a domain of existence of psychical stuff, marked by processes totally unlike those of the external world which confronted mind. So yeah, the assumption that the psychical is totally separate, distinct from the physical. You see this in, as he said, 16th and 17th centuries. You see this in places like Galileo, who was, in this scientific ideas of Galileo, who kind of separated off the physical, things that have primary qualities, from the secondary qualities, which he tended to attribute to the soul, or we might today say the mind, as opposed to objects in the world. And then objects in the world had a different kind of quality that could be measured, quantified. And so there was this gulf. Some things belong to the physical world, some things belong to the mental or psychical or soul, world of the soul. And Dewey says, the older Greek conception that the difference was one of the type of organization of common materials and processes was lost from view. So that is the idea that the difference between what we might call mental processes, what we might call physical processes, that these are different kinds of organizations of a common material, a common kind of stuff, that was lost from view. Psychology and epistemology accepted complete dualism. The bifurcation of nature and the theory of thought and ideas was wrought into conformity with the dualistic assumption. So yeah, the rise of mind-body dualism, mind-matter dualism, which we are trying to reject in this book. Let's see. Yeah, so last paragraph I'm going to do in this video. On the positive side, Dewey says, on the positive side, psychology is itself a special branch of inquiry, right? So psychology is in one sense not so special, right? It's not marked off totally from other things. It's a kind of inquiry like all the other sciences are. In general, it bears the same relation to the theory of logical inquiry that is sustained by physics or chemistry. But as it is more directly concerned with the focal center of initiation and execution of inquiry than are these other sciences, it may, if employed as servant and not as master of logic, make a contribution to logical theory which they cannot make. Right? So psychology is more concerned with the organism's thoughts and feelings, right? And those are connected with the beginning of inquiry, as well as all the rest of the processes of inquiry, right? When we consummate our inquiry, when we achieve the thing we wanted, we can think of that as that's a behavior, it's a state of the organism. Certain feelings attend on that, and these things are studied by psychologists. So psychologists can make an important contribution to logical theory, more so than physics or chemistry, which are just concerned with the material world, the not necessarily living material world. And of course, inquiry is something that comes out of living things. Psychology is fundamentally concerned with living things, although, of course, some philosophers would want to suggest that non-living matter can have psychic states too, but Dewey does not take that route. Neither do I, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. So yeah, psychology is extra important among the sciences because it's concerned with the organism. It's much more concerned with the organism, with living things that have cognition and behavior and all of that stuff, which are important parts of inquiry, fundamental to inquiry, in fact. All right, so personally, as has just been said, I doubt the existence of anything mental in the doctrinal sense alleged. So mental as a kind of separate thing marked off from the natural or physical world. But it is not necessary to go into that question, for, as was stated, if there is anything of this kind, it is irrelevant to the theory of inquiry. Moreover, any investigation into it must itself be an inquiry that satisfies the logical conditions of all inquiry. Nevertheless, whatever throws any light upon the organic conditions and processes that are involved in the occurrence and conduct of inquiry, as a sound biological psychology cannot fail to do, can hardly fail to make valuable contributions to the results of inquiry into inquiry. Yeah, so it's not necessary in terms of building up a logic well-grounded in the nature of biology and life. It's not necessary to kind of come down on one side or another of the issue of whether mental has any special kind of existence. I think it'll be clear that Dewey doesn't think it has any special kind of existence. But yeah, so it's not an important aspect of logic. And in fact, if the mental is something totally separate from organic nature, material nature, then it's not exactly clear how we could investigate it. But even if we were to investigate it, our inquiry into it would still have to conform to whatever logical conditions we end up deriving from our investigation of life and living things and the pattern of life behavior, life activity. All right, so I'm going to conclude this part here, and there will probably be like 2 more videos on chapter 2, and then we'll be moving on, so that's exciting. So I'm going to break here, and then the next section is going to continue up on the question of experience. Okay.